Today, Biden gives a fiery speech at the NATO summit in DC, while in Moscow, Putin and India's Modi share a warm embrace. And Michigan becomes ground zero for bird flu testing. It's Wednesday, July 10th. This is Reuters World News, bringing you everything you need to know from the front lines in 10 minutes every weekday. I'm Tara Oakes in Liverpool.
But make no mistake, Ukraine can and will stop Putin.
US President Joe Biden pledging to forcefully defend Ukraine against Russia's invasion at the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. But more than just a show of support for Ukraine, Biden is using the global stage to shore up his own support both at home and among world leaders. Dogged by a poor debate performance against former President Donald Trump and growing calls from within his own party that he stepped down, a lot is riding on the 81-year-old's NATO performance, convincing skeptics that he can still lead.
The United States will make sure that when we export critical air defense interceptors, Ukraine goes to the front of the line. Ukraine will prevail.
The centerpiece of the NATO summit, fresh commitments of military and humanitarian aid for Ukraine. Biden, along with the leaders of Germany, Italy, the Netherlands and Romania, issued a joint statement with Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky to deliver 5 additional Patriot and other strategic air defense systems. A day before NATO leaders began arriving in Washington, in Moscow, Vladimir Putin was greeting Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi with a bear hug. That image appeared as pictures emerged from Ukraine of a strike on a children's hospital. The attack overshadowed Modi's trip, and, sat next to Putin in the Kremlin a day later, he condemned the hospital strike. He said the sight of innocent children dying shatters the heart, and that a solution to the war cannot be found on the battlefield. The comments came on Modi's first overseas trip since winning a third term. Sanjeev Miglani covers India for us. Sanjeev, how was the summit viewed by the West?
There were already concerns about this trip, and India is supposed to be a strategic partner of the US for the last several years. But at the same time, India has had long-standing relations with Russia, and so there is a sense in Delhi that India needs to follow its own diplomatic path.
Was it a surprise that Modi condemned the hospital attack?
It was a surprise. It was quite striking to be able to go that far face-to-face. We do not recall a single leader on a physical sort of setting in the Kremlin to be saying in such clear terms. India has sort of resisted it condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, yeah, it's been a bit of a diplomatic tightrope walk, and some of it was out in the open on Monday and Tuesday.
The White House has said India could play a part in getting Putin to end the war. Can India play a mediator role?
That's a good question. That has come up constantly since this war began, that there could be a way that India could play a role. And India's long-standing relations with Russia from the Cold War days and this newfound, or at least a few years now, with this warmth with the US, it's in a position to sort of play a role in a way. Obviously, China can't do that. And Modi, the sort of politician, the senior leader that he is with his nationalist background and great support in India, he has a sense that he can do things that others have failed, previous Indian prime ministers have failed. And he didn't go into the specifics, but it sounded like that there was some real conversation. And Putin also said that we agree that there has to be a solution to this.
Were these talks key for India because of Russia's close relationship with China?
Absolutely. From the Indian perspective, this is also to do with finding some sort of balance between Russia and China and this closeness between what they said that the relationship has no limits. It's a no limits relationship. That is sort of kind of stuff in Delhi. It kind of raises some level of concern at the back of their heads, given that India and China, our relationship has been pretty fraught. So a lot of people in Delhi sort of said that this trip, the summit, not a great timing, but it had to be done. He needs to do this because you've got to keep Russia on side.
Several high-ranking European officials in town for the NATO summit have met with a top foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump. Keith Kellogg, who is Chief of Staff on Trump's National Security Council, has met with several European officials, including foreign ministers, as allies prepare for the possible re-election of the former president. He did not disclose their identities or details of what was discussed. A Moscow court has ordered the arrest of Yulia Navalnaya, the widow of late Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny. The court has accused Navalnaya, who lives outside Russia, of participating in an extremist group. The decision means she would face certain arrest if she set foot in the country. Writing on X, she called Putin a, quote, murderer and a war criminal.
5, 4, 3.
Europe is back in space.
Top. Allumage 2 ESR, décollage.
The Ariane 6 rocket carried out a series of trials in a debut flight on Tuesday. But the mission ended with the launcher coasting in orbit without releasing its final batch of payloads. Fed Chair Jerome Powell is signalling that the case for interest rate cuts is becoming stronger. Carmel Crimmins has more on his appearance in Congress.
This is no longer an overheated economy. This is an economy, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that is more or less back by most measures to where it was before the pandemic.
Powell telling lawmakers inflation isn't the only risk facing the central bank. Though, and no surprise here, Powell wouldn't tip his hat to senators as to when interest rate cuts might be coming.
We need just to see more good inflation data.
Are we weeks away, months away?
I'm going to try to avoid sending any really specific signals about time today because it's going to depend on the data.
After his remarks, investors are still betting on a rate cut in September. And if you're interested in the risks ahead for central banks as they navigate towards lower interest rates, check out this week's episode of Reuters Econ World. I'm joined by Augustine Carstens. He's General Manager of the Bank for International Settlements. That's the central bank to the world's central bankers. The pod is out today on the Reuters app, Reuters.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. There's a newsletter to accompany the show, and you can sign up for that on Reuters.com.
Michigan is taking the threat of bird flu very seriously. Public health experts fear the disease has the potential to turn into another pandemic. But the state's efforts to stop the spread of a virus in animals and people is being met with some pushback from those on the front lines. Dairy farmers. Reporter Tom Polansek was in Michigan to talk to some of these dairy farmers. So, Tom, first, why is Michigan ground zero for these containment efforts? What is it that they're trying to do?
Michigan has been a hotspot for infections of dairy cattle with bird flu since the outbreak began. The state has tried to aggressively test cattle to detect any outbreaks as a way to identify the scope of the outbreak and figure out how to stop it. The state has imposed its own state rules on dairy farms. They have to disinfect the vehicles that are coming on and off the farm to make delivery. They have to keep a log book of all their visitors. And there are some other steps also that some of the farmers feel like are a burden on them.
And so why are workers pushing back?
They're not sure exactly how the virus is spreading. They just don't know whether the requirements that the state has imposed will stop the spread of the virus. And just like COVID, there's some resistance to the state-imposed rules on operations.
Like what?
One farmer that I spoke with in Remus, Michigan, said that in the past, his workers have resisted wearing protective goggles over their eyes because it's just a pain. They have to clean the milk off the glasses and it slows down their work.
How do the farmers you spoke to feel about all this?
I had one farmer tell me that every day he wakes up and wonders whether today is going to be the day that his cows test positive. They worry about the risk of losing business because of infections. They worry that they won't be able to sell their milk if they test positive.
For more on any of the stories we featured today, check out Reuters.com or the Reuters app. And to never miss an episode, subscribe on your favourite podcast player. We'll be back tomorrow with our daily headline show.